Right, so in 1994, I was 20 years old, and I was, let me see, pushing the right button here. I was obsessed with pop music for some reason, and what was on the radio at the time was a single song all summer long throughout the UK and Ireland called Love Is All Around, and it really got on my nerves, and I had kind of a headache at the time, but the headache actually didn't have anything to do with this music. I was living in Glasgow. I was working at Glasgow University. I was learning how to work on the internals of GHC. I was working for Simon Peyton Jones as a summer intern, as an undergraduate. I was way out of my depth. I had a bunch of postdocs I was surrounded with and graduate students, and I had very little idea what I was doing, but I was thoroughly enjoying myself. I was learning how to play Go in the computer lab there. It was a wonderful crowd of people. It was a very sociable bunch of people who were all very much interested in, going out for a drink after work and getting some food and then going back and hacking some more on whatever their project happened to be. And it was really a kind of a wonderful environment for somebody so young and impressionable and easily star bedazzled to work in, because we had people like Philip Wadler and, of course, Simon and various other people in the department at the time. Glasgow was it wasn't the center of the functional programming universe, but it was a large galaxy, and there were other large galaxies, but there weren't very many of them. So I made lots of friends while I was there, and I very much enjoyed myself. And one of these friends was a fellow named Jim. And Jim was a postdoc. He was, like most Glaswegians at the time, from America. And why else did I have a headache while I was working there at the time? On this particular day, it was probably around now, in sort of, mid-August, early September, just as I was beginning to kind of pack up to head back. Well, we had this habit of going out for a drink. There was a restaurant nearby called Ashoka, which served a very fine pint of heavy and did wonderful, wonderful Indian food. And so after one particularly difficult night out, Jim heads off home, and he falls asleep, as one does, and he has a dream. And you know how dreams can be. You can never quite tell how they're going to be, especially if you've had, a couple of beers and a little bit of Indian food. So fortunately, this wasn't a bad dream. It wasn't one of these ones where you wake up and go, well, are my parts all still a part of me? No, actually what happened in Jim's dream was he met a beautiful woman. And the two of them, they hit it off wonderfully in this dream. And they got on famously. And as a matter of fact, she even gave him her phone number in the dream. And he woke up. And he realized something tremendously surprising. It was the most wonderful, wonderful thing. He actually remembered her phone number. So he scrabbles around for a piece of paper, and he writes it down, and he comes into the lab in the morning, and I've got my headache, and he says to me, Bryan, I've got a question for you. What do I do with this phone number? Like, I've got it right here. And I say, well, why don't you hand it to me and I'll take a look? So he hands over this piece of paper to me, and I unfold it, and it's all kind of crumpled up and a little bit sweaty. And I tell him, hang on a second, I actually recognize this phone number. And of course, it turns out to be the call-out number for the local pizza delivery place. So why would I want to tell this particular story? Like, it's just, some random kid in Glasgow having a good time in the middle of summer. Mostly because it made such an impression on me. As a matter of fact, the interesting thing about the impression is I forgot that story for about 14 years until Andy Gill told me this story about me last year. So, but nevertheless, it still illustrates a point, which is that the community of functional programmers was the thing that really kind of drew me in at the time. We have this great intellectual energy, and it goes back a very long time, right? And most people like to belong to some kind of community. Everybody here obviously does, or else you'd be off at home instead of visiting with us here today. And so, much as I loved the Haskell community, I happened to not stay in it for very long at the time. I wandered off to America, got myself a job, found a girlfriend, settled down, and lived in Silicon Valley and did all of that kind of thing. So fast forward a good 10 years plus, and I'm a little bit bored at work, right? I'm working for a startup. We build supercomputing hardware. We build some of the best supercomputing hardware that money can possibly buy, except that money isn't actually buying very much of it. So we're about to get bought as a company. And I'm a little bit kind of, I'm itchy. I'm wondering, well, what am I going to do with my spare time? So I decide to go back into spending a little bit of attention on functional programming again. And of course, I return to my first love, Haskell. Actually, Haskell wasn't quite my first love. Now that I think about it, it was probably Scheme that I started off with. But it didn't take long for me to convert over. So the community around Haskell was as energetic as ever. Many of the same gallery of rogues that were still doing research back in 1995 were doing research in 2005. And of course, the community was still kind of introverted, right? People would come to conferences, they would give papers to each other, they would talk, and it was very much a kind of an inward-facing thing, for the most part. You know, we had the occasional free radical that would escape off like Eric Meyer and go and basically turn C# into Haskell and so on. But for the most part, you know, it's been an environment where people are talking to each other and not so much spreading the word. So I want you to think for a minute about how you learned Haskell or Erlang or OCaml or Scheme or whatever the language was. You may have been lucky enough to learn at the hands of a lecturer. We didn't do any functional programming at Trinity College in Dublin, where I went to college. So as a result, I didn't really go to any of my classes because they weren't teaching me anything that I wanted to learn. So I picked up a book by a gentleman whose name was Martin Henson. He was, I think, at the University of Kent at the time. His book was called Elements of Functional Languages. And I took it on a summer internship with me the year before that I went to Glasgow. And I just got completely absorbed in it. And I actually got in touch with Martin Henson last year after the Haskell book came out, because I was like, oh, he knows what it's like. And I said to him, so thanks very much for writing your book. I really enjoyed it. I just wanted to let you know that this thing that you wrote back in 1989 had a big effect on me as a writer, as a programmer, and so on and so forth. And so, what are you doing these days? And he wrote back at this very gracious email saying, well, thanks very much. It's really nice to hear that I've had this effect on people through my work. And he's now the Dean of International Development at a university in southern England somewhere. So you never know where functional programming is going to take you. So, of course, the way that I came up through the ranks was basically by kind of immersing myself in reading many papers, you know, lots of issues of JFP, as many papers as I could download online, functional pearls, thousands of lines of code, you know, downloading the GHC source code and reading the internals, grabbing whatever packages I could find off the net and just sort of looking through them, and, of course, writing lots and lots of garbage, you know. And it's a productive way to learn, but as a matter of an approach, it's very haphazard. You know, I happened to kind of do this random walk through the literature that suited me well enough, but it was a matter of tenacity and persistence on my part that actually made this a possibility, right? I'd find a paper, I'd go through the references, I'd try and find what other papers I could find to download online, and it took a lot of work, right? So I Googled and I read, and I Googled and I read some more, and it was, you know, I joined the IRC channel on Pound Haskell on irc.freenode.net, which is one of the biggest channels on there these days. And you kind of get the idea, right? It was self-directed, which is kind of wonderful. But at the same time, it was unstructured, and it took me longer than it ought to have to learn some things. You know, for example, like everybody else, I bounced off Monads for quite a while. In fact, when I was back at, you know, a wee fellow of 20 at Glasgow University, Philip Wadler was working in the basement at the time and was gracious enough to kind of accept me into his office and sort of try and explain Monads to me, and over my head it went. In spite of him being very good at explaining it, I hadn't kind of reached a level where I was able to absorb it just yet. So fair play to him for putting up with me, but it took me another 15 years to pick up this idea. So I decided that I'd sit down and I would write a book about Haskell. You know, I thought, well, you know, what can I do to kind of make a bit of a difference, make things easier for other people? Well, maybe I could put together a tome of my own. And the first thing that I did was decide, well, this is going to be a little bit too much work for me, right? I put together a book plan, an outline of what the chapters ought to be, and it just stretched and it stretched and it stretched, and I thought, this isn't so very good. But it was going to be the way that I was going to learn the last bits of Haskell that I hadn't quite gotten around to, such as, for example, monad transformers and, well, how exceptions work and all that kind of business. So it took 1.5 years worth of work, and along the way I found myself some collaborators. So one of the first people that I went after was Don Stewart, because he was very active in the Haskell IRC channel, and he knew the answer to every question, right? So those are the kinds of people that you want to have on board with a project. And he was extremely approachable, of course, too. And as we were starting to talk to an editor at O'Reilly named Mike Lukides, he mentioned that he had heard that there was somebody else shopping a book manuscript around. And this guy was a fellow named John Gortson. And John was not somebody who had come up through the kind of traditional academically oriented Haskell community. He had actually been a Debian hacker back in the day, and he had written several successful books on programming in Python. And John was a well-respected, very talented open source programmer. And And the strange thing was he worked for a tractor mower manufacturing company in the middle of Kansas. So what better a person to anchor a book on real-world applications of Haskell than somebody who actually uses it to produce tractors, right? So over the course of this 1.5 years that we worked on the book, we wrote 710 pages of text. We developed it all in XML using darts, and it was a very interesting and entertaining experience. One of the things that we did along the way was we actually posted chapters incrementally as we wrote them. And I developed this little small web application that would let you click on the end of a paragraph in any chapter, and somebody could add comments on it. So normally, if you write a technical book, what happens is you'll get 2 or 3 reviewers, they'll get paid some sort of a nominal fee, and it's kind of their job to go through this book, page after page after page, and submit comments back to you. And of course, that all happens pretty much when the book is already done. So you think that you're done, and the very next thing that you have to deal with is this wad of feedback from people talking about chapters that you wrote a year ago that you can't remember what they are, and you really don't want to bring them back into your memory again. But by virtue of this web application, we had over 800 reviewers for our book, which is kind of an astounding number, right? So we got 400 times as many reviewers as the typical technical book. In addition, we had in excess of 7,500 comments from these people on the different paragraphs that we wrote. Which I'm inclined to think is not too shabby a number. So now the challenge is for you to go and do the same thing, right? I've kind of done my part. Don has done his part. John has done his part. We have 5 or 6 other people in this room who have done their thing as far as writing books is concerned. And this very much ties into what Francesco was saying a little while earlier. I can't overestimate or overstate the importance of spending a bit of time and sitting down and writing about something that you know. You don't have to be the expert at it or anything like that. But so think about, like, what are the things that Haskell, as a community of people who are all concerned about substantially the same problems, are good at? Or the OCaml community, or the Scheme community, right? We're pretty good at doing research, and we're good at writing about research for each other. When it comes to reaching out to the outside world, we have, what would you say, more of a let the mountain come to my habit kind of attitude historically, right? There are some isolated sets of people, well, I wouldn't call them isolated, but they're different from the bulk of us, who do a good job of outreach. So, for example, the Erlang community has been very good at kind of getting the word out. So we have people like Francesco, we have people like Ulf in the audience here who are extremely good at kind of going out, banging the drum, and, for want of a better phrase, developing business for themselves and developing a name for their language, for their community. And that you can see how that's paid off in what they do. So it's not so clear to me that, in general, functional programmers have done a fantastic job of reaching out to people. What we've done is we have been kind of a little bit introverted, right, as I've mentioned a few times. So what do you need to do if you want to write a book? You don't need to produce another 700-page long book. I mean, you're welcome to, by all means, but that's not what the business is about, right? For one thing, you don't want to be spending 1.5 years of your life on this. It's rewarding when it's all done, but it's not actually the most enjoyable thing to do, to lock yourself into your writer's garret for a long period of time. You don't need to describe the latest, greatest research. And as a matter of fact, I think that for your own sanity and for the sanity of the people who are going to be reading your books, it's probably best that you leave the descriptions of your research to environments like ICFP or IFP or Paddle or whatever it happens to be, because those are the best places for the rough edges to get knocked off. And if your stuff is actually worth paying attention to, it'll basically be a situation of a rising tide over the course of several years as people kind of go, oh yeah, here's this wonderful thing that I hadn't been paying attention to, and now I find myself getting great value out of it. So the things that you need in order to be able to write successfully are an idea. You need to have something that you're going to write about. You do not have to be the world's expert in this subject. I certainly wasn't the world's expert in Haskell programming when I began, and I'm certainly not the world's expert in Haskell programming now, right? You need to have some sort of explanatory skill, and you need to have an honest assessment of your ability to explain things to other people, right? Within the research and the academic and the computing communities, there's a large number of people who are very good at explaining things to themselves or to people who already know what they're explaining about. And as it turns out, that's not a wonderful skill when it comes to expository writing for a community of people who have no prior background in what you're talking about. And of course, the other thing that you need is tenacity, patience, a tolerance for pain, you like suffering, and you don't mind people telling you that what you've done is complete crap. So, I even have some ideas for you about the book that you can be writing, and a lot of these will have blah, 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 Haskell tagged on, right? But you don't have to pay attention to the Haskell. It could just as easily be blah, blah, blah scheme. It could just as easily be blah, blah, blah OCaml, or whatever it happens to be. Or, for that matter, Agda or Coq. Please. So, writing and tuning fast code, right? How do you produce programs in Haskell that run efficiently? There's a handful of people in the audience who know how to do this. I kind of know how to do it, and it's a little bit of a dark art, right? So it'd be wonderful if more people knew how to do this. Not a book that has to be 700 pages long, right? Parallel programming in Haskell. There are many different parallel programming paradigms floating around in Haskell. I'm not talking about multi-threaded programming. I'm talking about just answering one question as fast as possible. How do you go about producing a parallel program in a functional language? High assurance programming. If I'm sending a probe into outer space, how do I make sure that it doesn't crash to Earth and deploy plutonium over the greater Glasgow and Edinburgh area? Modeling, be it discrete event simulation or finite element modeling or continuous time simulation, we have people who know how to do that. They ought to be talking to each other and saying, hey, why don't we write a book about this? Because there are people who spend their entire careers modeling things. Abstract algebra. Alexander Stepanov has just written a book called Elements of Programming. And it's kind of the first book that attempts to bring an algebraic approach to programming for kind of real-world programmers. But I find it a little bit tricky to read. I have a copy of it at home, and it's written in this very dry kind of Russian style, and you have to love C++ in order to get through it too. But one of the things that he uses, for example, is this idea of concepts in C++. And concepts are merely rebranded Haskell type classes with an extra layer of C++ syntactic special sauce on top. And of course, he's using concepts, but they're not even in the language now. They just got voted off the island by the committee a little while ago. So he's got this sub-language of C++ that you can't quite use, and you have to sort of go through all these loops with iterators and lots of big type annotations and so on. And so you're often losing the forest for the trees of the language. And where else but in Haskell do we have a wonderful way of talking about things like monoids and semi-near rings and algebras and all that kind of stuff in a way that is relatively straightforward to grasp. So please go write a book like this. Complex functional applications, right? You sit down and you open up something like a physics engine. The Havoc physics engine, for example, is several million lines of C++. There aren't all that many several million line Haskell programs out there, or Erlang programs, or any other kinds of programs. And as a result, there is not much knowledge in the community out there of how do I structure a large stateful application, a large application that in a C++ environment, or a C environment, or a Java environment, I would have some idea of how to get a tractable hold of. Right? This is a huge gap in the community's awareness, right? As academics and as researchers, people are good at producing things that are 1,000, 5,000, even sometimes 100,000 lines of code. But they're not very good so far at telling people, how do you produce a 100,000 line application and make it maintainable, make it durable? How to work with monads, right? Monads are not especially scary, but people are not very good at producing their own. Network programming, right? You could spend a lot of time talking about existing approaches with lazy I/O, why those are scary, why you'd want to be using something else instead, how you could use inversion of control using an iteratee-style mechanism or something like that to write efficient programs that operate over unreliable networks. Very interesting and practical topic. Functional Perls, JFP has had years and years and years of really interesting stuff in there, from finger trees and their relations to monoids over all kinds of different subjects. That's just the first one that popped into my head. Other things that have kind of come to mind are things like the deconstruction of Google's MapReduce, which was borrowed and kind of sullied from functional programming, and then sort of revived as, well, let's take a principled type-driven approach to how do we look at something like MapReduce and then say what the types of the various different things involved are. How do you do functional testing, right? Most of the people in this room have probably used something like QuickCheck for probabilistic testing. But I wouldn't say that the knowledge of how to use it is all that terribly widespread, right? The really deep knowledge. There was a great tutorial on it last year, but unfortunately I've forgotten a fair bit of what I learned in that tutorial. And this in spite of the fact that I use QuickCheck fairly obsessively. So that's just 10 ideas off the top of my head that I developed around midnight last night. Bang, 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 I just banged them out. And they're seriously all compelling ideas for things that you could be telling the broader world about. Now, who is the broader world? The broader world is not you, and it's not people in this room. The broader world is people who are trying to earn a crust, who are trying to produce real code, right? There's an awful lot of people out there who are very smart at what they're doing, but for example, they've never used a programming language that has malloc. They don't have dynamic memory allocation in their languages, but nevertheless, they are able to send probes to Mars. And there are other people out there who do weather prediction, and they have never used a language that has support for threads, and so on, right? There are these environments and these communities of people who are struggling with the tools that they have, but they don't really have a way to bootstrap themselves to something better, because we haven't gone and said, here are the things you need to know in order to be successful, in order to be able to do high-performance computing, distributed computing, or whatever it happens to be that you personally know how to do that they don't know how to do in your language of choice. So, you need to look to other communities of people who write software, and because if we don't talk to them, right, they're by and large not going to come to us. It is the case that there has been this rising interest in functional programming over the past decade. And as Francesco mentions, a lot of that interest has come from books. An awful lot of that interest has also come from communities like the Python programming language, the Perl programming language, the Ruby programming language, right? The general level of consciousness has kind of slowly raised to the point where people can accept and understand closures, higher order functions, and at some point we hope that they'll be able to accept the idea that static types doesn't necessarily mean that they're being stuffed into a little Java box and tossed overboard. So, what else would I like to talk about in this context? Right, there's a gentleman named Anthony Stafford Beer who died several years ago, and I have a kind of a thesis about gentlemen who look like this. If you reach your late 50s and you have a big flowing beard and you have a big furry sweater like that, the chances are that you're likely to have something very interesting to say. So I would encourage you to look around and find somebody who looks like that in the audience. There are several. And go, well, what interesting things do you have to say to me? And I bet you'll find that that thesis generally bears out. And Anthony Stafford Beer was an influential cybernetician. Now, what a wonderful job title that is, right? Cybernetics is the science of effective organization. And I don't know if you've ever gone and read any papers from the 1940s by people like Norbert Wiener or Vannevar Bush about the early days of information systems theory. But it's crazy, crazy stuff, right? These people are just making up the craziest of geodesic structures and saying, well, we'll get this part of the organization up here on this part of the dodecahedron, talking down here to this other part of the organization via this network of graphs, and it's just wild. It makes no sense whatsoever, but they actually had quite a bit of influence on the way the world worked. So in 1970, Anthony Stafford Beer got invited to Chile by the government of Salvador Allende. And he was invited to set up this wild experiment, which was a system for centralized control of the Chilean economy, right? And this is an actual this is not like science fiction here. This is a picture of the interior of the Project CyberSyn control room in Santiago in Chile. And the way that Project CyberSyn was going to work was that they had a network of telex machines spread throughout factories all over Chile. And the idea was the telex machines would send in, here are the primary materials I am consuming, here are the secondary materials I am producing. And the boffins off in Santiago would say, well, you need to do this, this, and this in order to have your successful economic production do its thing. And as a matter of fact, this environment, crazy as it sounds, right, with these chairs and wonderful wall paneling and great green carpet, it was actually somewhat successful. There was a big truckers' strike in 1972 where 40,000 professional truckers throughout Chile all downed tools and said, we're not driving trucks anywhere. And through Project CyberSyn and its network of telex machines, the government of Salvador Allende managed to actually keep the Chilean economy going. They had 200 truck strike breakers who were willing to drive trucks, drive them through the picket lines. This is not something I'm necessarily advocating as a path to success with your friends, by the way, but they found 200 people who were willing to act as scabs anyway. And they managed to keep the economy going. The factories managed to get out the things that they needed to, and they managed to consume the stuff that they needed to as well. Whoops, I'm going in the wrong direction here. And so in spite of the fact that Allende was killed during the revolution the following year, the CyberSyn project was kind of a success, even though it was built on these wacky principles, right? What's his name? Benoit Mandelbrot had not come along yet and said, hey, how about chaos and nonlinear dynamics and our inability to successfully predict what a complex system is actually going to do in the future? These guys didn't know that this was going to be impossible, so they just went and did it. And that sounds very similar to a kind of, what would you say, a mindset that is prevalent in the functional programming community, right? So something that Beer became known for later on, I think part of his idea of wearing these heavy sweaters was that after his experience in Chile, he actually moved to the hills in Wales and renounced all earthly belongings, but still consulted, right? So he was a hillman and an intellectual and kind of an aesthete, right? But he still consulted on how you should manage your organizations from the Chiltern Hills or wherever it was that he happened to be. And he coined this acronym, POSIWID. And POSIWID stands for the purpose of a system is what it does. Right? So the idea here is that you don't try to understand a system based on what the people who are putting the system together tell you that it's for. Because you're going to invariably be influenced and misled by people telling you, well, this system is for something, right? So let's take, for example, global trade as an instance, right? Global trade, people who promote global trade will tell you that the idea is to make poor nations poorer or poor nations richer. But you might look at what global trade actually does in practice and you might come to a somewhat different conclusion. If you observe what a system does instead of what people tell you about what it's supposed to do, you'll come up with all kinds of counterintuitive and, according to the promoters of the system, probably counterfactual observations about what it's really doing. So my question is, given that Beer had some unusual ideas and managed to get them implemented, from this POSIWID perspective, the purpose of a system is what it does. What does functional programming actually do, right? And I have some ideas about what functional programming does, and they're not necessarily all completely comfortable ideas. So functional programming fills my eyes with stars, right? And it makes graduate students very happy, and for a community of professors, it gives them a great lifelong job. But then there are people who go on and they get their PhDs and they go off into industry and they're working in Java. So maybe for some of those people, functional programming so far has been an environment that leads to some disappointment because they don't get to do it on a day-to-day basis. So the question then is, what part do you want to play in changing what functional programming does, right? I'm not suggesting that we want to become rock stars, because there are various different programming communities that have a rock star-oriented attitude, the most notable one being the Ruby community. Right? So Ruby was this kind of backwater small talk-like language for a number of years until some people came along and said, hey, we can develop web apps. And we can develop web apps for cheap, and we can develop web apps quickly, and we can develop web apps in this wonderful cargo cultish kind of way. And they developed this environment of kind of hero worship, and it became a very toxic kind of community. So it went from friendly, small, obscure, there was nothing particularly at stake there, to this kind of virile, strutting place that I personally wouldn't terribly want to be associated with. So I'm not suggesting that the rockstar path is the one that you necessarily ought to take. Maybe there's a set of functional programmers who really want to be rock stars, and best of luck to you lads. But I am also considering that perhaps the direction that functional programming wants to go in is different from the past direction that functional programming has gone in, right? So I look up in the audience here and I see many of the same people who were at CUFP last year. And I dare say that many of the people who were at CUFP last year were at CUFP before. So as I've mentioned several times throughout this talk so far, we have this habit of talking to ourselves. And we tell ourselves that functional programming, of course, it's better than the alternatives, it's better than imperative programming, it's better than object-oriented programming, it's just kind of nice. But we don't go out and we don't put any weight behind that to the outer, larger community. There are thousands of functional programmers in the world, perhaps tens of thousands of functional programmers in the world, but there are millions of professional programmers out there doing their Java stuff, doing their Ruby stuff, doing their Python stuff, whatever it happens to be. The community of people who use Python for science, for bioinformatics, for statistics, for things like that, Python just for this purpose, is probably about the same size as the Haskell community, judging by the estimates that I was able to make during a brief bout of Googling after some beers last night. So, we would like to, by and large, I believe, grow the FP community and actually put some spine to our rhetoric of functional programming matters, functional programming is better. So the onus is on us to actually do that outreach, write those books, give talks, but not to functional programmers, give talks to people, to environments like the JAOO conference, the conferences that the InfoQ people organize. Go out there and make sure that people understand what kinds of interesting things you're doing, how they have relevance to the real world, and what it is that you can teach them and that they might be able to go, oh wow, and get the stars in their eyes like I did. So thanks very much. And I don't mean just thanks, by the way, for listening to what I have to say, but I came back to functional programming after 10 years of kind of doing stuff off in the commercial wilderness, mostly because of people who are in the audience today and people who are like the people who are in the audience today, right? We have this welcoming, smart community. We have not given up intellectual excitement or inquiry in order to be nice to each other. And so it's this wonderful ferment of ideas and people willing to clink a beer and people willing to say, well, you know, I'm going to take the idea that you developed here in OCaml and I'm going to apply it over here in Haskell, and then I'm going to slag off Erlang a little bit and say, well, we can get more threads in Haskell, but really I'm kind of jealous of the Erlang people because they've got a little bit more money. It's a wonderful environment, right? You couldn't possibly ask for a better bunch of people, so why aren't we all going out and saying, please, come join us, do more, right? That's pretty much all I have to say. Thanks very much for your time.
If you've got any questions, if you could just go up to the microphones and press the button, and then the camera will zoom straight towards you and you'll be recorded and nothing's going to get lost. Don't be scared.
Just really a quick observation. I was to CFP in Portland a couple of years ago, and it struck me that it was a very, very introverted community. Given that there are two of the most influential people in IT are Paul Graham, who's a list packer, and Joel Spolsky, who worked on Excel, I made a suggestion in Portland that why don't you try and get somebody who's really famous to come to UFP, and then, oh, this is a great audience, by the way, it's much bigger than Portland, which was 4 years ago, it's 2 or 3 times as big, but, you know, it is a real problem, and it's a problem that Erlang's had as well, of being inwardly facing communities. There are really good, you know, Paul Graham's essay on sharper tools, it's exactly what everyone wants to say. You can do better things with smarter languages, and he's already said it, and thousands of people know him. So, just
I think actually that, yeah, as a strategy for attracting people to something like CUFP, that would be a good idea. But you also need to do an inversion of control, right? Like I was talking about earlier. You need to not just try and bring people from the outside to talk to the FP community that already exists, because they're going to be preaching to the choir, right? You'll hope to attract outsiders just to hear the likes of Paul Graham speak. But we also need to be sending ourselves out to their kinds of communities and their conferences, their get-togethers, their confabs, and say, you know, here's what we have to offer in addition, right? Because we don't lack for people with Paul Graham's style of stature in the FP community. If every language has its set of people who are very bright, very outgoing, very much able to hold an audience and give a good talk. So I think it would be a good idea for us in CUFP to do that as kind of, well, an experiment. Let's see if we can bring in some fresh blood. But I think that it would not be the only thing that we ought to do.
The tools are now there, and the books are available, which they weren't 4 years ago. So the community is now ready to explode outwards.
That's true. There are more books there, and we're in a much better shape than we were several years ago, and that's really a great position to be in. But I think that it would not do us any harm at all to do more. Don.
One thing you didn't mention was the sort of grassroots hackathons and user groups that have sprung up. So I know, so this may be more an anecdote, we had no Haskell user groups a couple of years ago. And the Perl guys have been promoting this for 15 years and doing very well at it. But basically use the community to distribute the training around the world. Now there's maybe 15 Haskell user groups. The hackathon series has sort of just sprung up everywhere. There are all these independent hackathons happening. There's one in Portland next month. There was one in Philadelphia last month. So that's something I think, use the community to distribute the training around via the internet, but also via one-to-one interaction and training.
Yeah, that's a good point. And of course, there are also organizations like Anglo Haskell and so on that do their thing, and the London Haskell user group here in the UK, and other people like that in different areas, right? And the nice thing about those is anytime you organize some sort of a local get-together in a city or a metropolitan area that has a reasonable number of programmers, you're going to get curious outsiders coming along going, what's this all about? And it's kind of a charge to get to talk to a community of complete outsiders and say, here are the things that we're able to do. Isn't this kind of magic? And they'll go, yeah, it is. Wow, that's great. And then they'll go off and hopefully they'll pick up whatever it is that you're writing. By the way, I'd also encourage, if you are writing, I'd encourage you to strongly consider releasing your texts under some sort of an open license. Right? One of the things that worked really well for us with Real World Haskell was releasing the book under a commercial or Creative Commons license. And that was what enabled us to publish chapters early, and we still have the book online on the web. So that means that if you're in Azerbaijan or someplace like that, and I have gotten email from people in Azerbaijan saying, thank you very much for putting the book online. It's a nice thing to be able to do for the community, to have this body of knowledge that's on there that you don't have to pay $50 or £60 or 70 kopecks or whatever it happens to be to buy a copy of, right? It's just there. And it doesn't cannibalize your sales if you're considering actually trying to publish something, right? So you can go to your publishers and you can say, Bryan O'Sullivan told you that he published his book at the beginning of December in 2008, and that by Christmas of 2008, they had sold $112,000 worth of copies of this book, which is really not too bad for something on a relatively obscure subject, right? That's really pretty good for 4 weeks worth of sales. So consider the open licensing idea.
There's always the Pirate Bay.
There's always the Pirate Bay, that's true. But it's nice for the publishers not to feel like they're getting scammed. It does undercut the Pirate Bay. We offer it for better than free.
What kind of impact has Real World Haskell had that you've observed? Are people really making the jump to Haskell because of this book?
So that's a good question. There's certainly been a lot of buzz about it on, for example, Twitter and on blogs and the like, and we've gotten a large number of reviews on Amazon.com. So there's certainly a lot of people who are kind of digging in there. And the tweets that I enjoy on Twitter, for example, are things like, I just got to chapter 9 and I'm learning about monads, and obviously these guys have been setting me up all along with these various different structures that they've been developing, because it turns out that boom, 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 they're all monads, right? So clearly the program of indoctrination and of subversive messages in their sleep is working. And I think that as a practical matter too, it has made a difference, right? I mean, Don has talked about the hackathon idea, and the hackathon idea has come through the open source community, right? It has not been informed by the typical academic Haskell community. So there's this whole environment of people who never go to conferences, never read academic papers, never do any of those kinds of things that I did in order to get my start, and that most of the people in this room probably did to get their start, who are now going off and writing very interesting code. Some of the most interesting Haskell libraries and applications are being developed by people who just have no idea that stuff like us even exist, right? And it's partly due to the likes of the free availability of the book and the fact that people are chatting to each other over coffee and going, well, that's what happened. And you can also have the occasional strange thing occur, right? I've, on 2 occasions now in San Francisco, and possibly only in San Francisco could this occur, have people come up to me on the street and said, are you Bryan O'Sullivan? I'm like, yeah. Oh, I love your work. I'm like, I haven't really done anything. I've just been copying other people's ideas into this book. So, there's a little bit of surprise celebrity to be had from it. You can be the world's tiniest micro-celebrity. Okay. Don?
If I just might add something to that, something we've noticed at Galwar is that the people we're hiring now have typically read a Haskell book before they turn up for the interview. So it has an effect of lifting the standard of the developers you're getting in. As you're a small company trying to hire FP people, which which has been hard.
That's a very important
They're
point.
turning up now with like Erlang certification, or they've read Real World Haskell, end to end and released on Hackage. So it's much easier to hire. You don't have to put the investment into training. So I think that's a really good effect that we have.
Great. We could do something like that for Haskell too. Bottom certification. Right. Yep.
The Ruby community, part of what happened is that there are some rock stars, there are some personalities, right?
Oh yeah.
But it's also that they were playing rock and not playing jazz, right? And I think that, so this is more of an observation than it is a question, but I think it would be wonderful for functional programming if there were the equivalent of Rails, something that were rock and roll that people could grab onto that would be really useful for them.
I agree, and as a matter of fact, that seems to be coming along from various different directions, right? So there's a number of web application development frameworks available for Haskell now. Probably the most interesting of the lot is called Hapstack, which is this very interesting principled approach to doing web application development by way of something STM-like, for example, with distributed transaction support and only support for in-memory data. So it doesn't even talk to databases normally. And that's not alone, right? Excuse me, there are other Django-influenced web application frameworks for doing that kind of work in Haskell. I can't say that I've actually used any of them personally so far, but they certainly exist.
I wanted to follow up on that community comment. You referred to this acronym POSIWIT and said, so what is functional programming? So I think my undergraduates would say it's a means of torturing people. But looking around here, one answer is that it's a community.
Yes, absolutely.
And one thing that I'm aware of, as you talk about we can grow, I suspect one reason we're such a nice community is we're all going, we have the right idea and they don't. And as we grow and become larger, we might keep that or we might lose it. I don't know what's going to happen.
There's undoubtedly a risk there, yes.
But I thought your talk was very good at developing this sense of community. It was a very friendly talk. It was handing out ideas and so on.
Thank you.
Just as the community is. And so I guess I want to draw attention to that positive way of doing things and say we might need to work at this harder as we grow.
Right.
There's an interesting opportunity and an interesting threat here. It'll be interesting to see how it plays out.
Well, the great thing about the FP community is that the people who are most influential within it happen to be such great people to deal with, right? So as long as the intellectual firmament of of all of our different communities are setting a tone that is positive and constructive, I think that we've got a pretty good shot at maintaining that kind of friendly face-to-face orientation as we continue to grow. Because at this point, we've kind of failed at our avoidance of success, and it's a matter of how much success we're willing to try and deal with. So, and how constructively we want to approach that and engage it.
How important do you think the uptake of functional programming on the sort of enterprise virtual machine platforms like Java and .NET are going to be in promoting F# and languages like that, in promoting functional languages across?
It's extremely important, right? There's a very large number of programmers out there who have never heard of open source, they've never heard of Linux, they're unaware of research, and they'll to a first approximation, pay very close attention to whatever they hear coming out of Microsoft. And I don't say that in any kind of a slighting way, right? People are busy and they have different sets of concerns. And I'm in no position to judge somebody who decides that they want to pay the bills by doing, programming in C# or whatever it happens to be. And so if people like Don Syme and Chris Smith and other such people decide that they want to spend their time developing a functional language for the .NET platform, that's extremely important, right? It's important both for being able to express functional ideas in a widely used platform sense, and also as a gateway drug to other languages that are not necessarily tied to that environment, right? So languages that might have some more challenging and interesting ideas baked into them, like your Haskell or looking into the far future, things like She or Agda 2 or whatever it happens to be, right? It's a stepping stone in those directions, and so it's important in its own right, and also for what it presents as an opportunity to the rest of us.
I think you talk about the functional programming community. I think one thing that's clear is as the community grows, it will become many communities, not just one. I think that's very important.
Yeah.
There's clearly parts of the functional programming community that has absolutely no interest in growth into the wider
That's very
world.
much true.
And that's perfectly cool. If people want to be researchers and talk to other researchers, that's an important aspect. And I think for the community to mature, it has to fragment in some ways in that sense. One wonders, though, whether some of the kind of key driving parts of the community, like, for example, the GHC developers, what's their view on trying to widen the usage of Haskell? It's they're going to have to start supporting a very different kind of user as the usage grows. I wonder what their sort of view on sort of community growth is. Is it important to them to grow the community?
Well, I won't speak for Simon. I can suspect that Simon probably has a bit of a headache as the community gets bigger and the number of bugs that he has to fix with each release gets larger. Simon, do you want to have a word?
Well, since you asked directly, so of course I'm just delighted that lots of people use GHC these days, and I think the demand pull that we get from users is actually a great research incentive because it makes us think of new things. The fact is, my base is in research, so I think I'm very lucky that Microsoft are prepared to pay me and Simon to do something. Part of what we do is really just fixing bugs and just making things work reliably. But our primary job is research. So I guess it's a kind of two-edged thing. I think we're going to need more and more help from people whose business is making things work in the real world. And the GHC is going to grow a larger and larger sort of surface area in terms of things that it's supposed to do, like dynamic libraries are a good example that happened recently that isn't really particularly researchy, but it's really important in practice. So I think we're going to need to have more and more participation from people who just help grow this stuff around the edges that isn't that people without big research backgrounds, but with familiarity with actual tools and platforms, of which I am woefully ignorant, can help with. So I think there's going to be more and more partnership and less, well, it's just GHC HQ, and if they don't do it, it's not going to happen.
Okay, I think we're done. Thanks very much again.